This is part 2 of chapter 3 from Meals to Molecules. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about what happens in terms of digestion and absorption after swallowing. So part 1 we went through hierarchy of life. We talked about the components of the GI tract and the digestive system as an overview, and now we're getting into exactly what's going on here. So we have the esophagus. The esophagus connects the pharynx, which remember is that little box where you can either swallow or inhale, right, to the stomach. And so the epiglottis is going to cover that trachea to allow food to go down the esophagus. The bolus of food, remember, is the combination of saliva and the partially digested food and the mucus, and it's moved by these rhythmic muscle contractions called peristalsis. So you can almost think of that as like squeezing a toothpaste tube. You have these muscular contractions that wave the food down into the stomach. Food passes through a muscular ring called a sphincter, and that could be called the gastroesophageal sphincter or the cardiac sphincter at the end of the esophagus to enter the stomach. And so if we look at that little sphincter, right, that sphincter needs to stay closed most of the time, except when a bolus is crossing over to the stomach. The reason for that is the acidity of the stomach is quite high, and if it leaks back into the esophagus, then you can end up having heartburn, is what we typically call it, or gastroesophageal reflux, and if that's chronic, it's called GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. So you can see as the sphincter opens, the bolus of food enters the stomach, and then the sphincter will close again. So the stomach has a number of different purposes. It's there for the temporary storage of food, and then it's the first place where proteins start to be digested, and that's due to the hydrochloric acid. The acid also kills microorganisms and activates a couple of different enzymes and inhibits other enzymes. So it activates pepsin, which is important for protein digestion, and it inhibits amylase, which remember was created by the saliva to start digesting starch. So carbohydrate digestion is actually turned off in the stomach because that amylase is denatured or unwound. Mucus is also in the stomach. It protects the lining from the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid, which are quite acidic in nature. And all of those things together, the water, the pepsin, and the hydrochloric acid, are called gastric juice. The muscular lining of the stomach helps to mix food, so you can think of it as almost a washing machine. It's churning and mixing. There's very little absorption that goes on in the stomach. Some exceptions to that rule include water. Water can be absorbed in the stomach, alcohol, aspirin, acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, all those things can be absorbed. Once you've mixed that bolus of food with acid, it now has a new name. It's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. That leaves the stomach to enter the small intestine through another sphincter, and that is called the pyloric sphincter or the pyloric valve. If you've ever tried going for a run or something and you kind of had food sitting in your stomach and you felt like it wasn't moving, that's because that pyloric valve doesn't open when we are exercising at a high intensity typically. So food that's in the stomach will remain in the stomach and give you maybe a little bit of upset in the digestive tract if you eat a little bit too close to exercising intensely. Stomach emptying is regulated by signals from the small intestines, and it's affected by both meal size and meal composition. So a bigger meal is going to empty a little bit longer and slower, and the meal composition, both protein and fat as well as fiber are going to slow down that digestion as well. So something pretty neat about the stomach is you can see that it has this surface epithelium. So the little surface epithelium is going to allow the stomach to to withstand the acidity. So that's why, you don't get heartburn in your stomach, you just get heartburn in your esophagus. That ends up happening because you don't have that surface epithelium in the esophagus or in the small intestines. So once that little pyloric valve opens in the small intestine, which is that sphincter you see on the bottom there, you can see that as it empties there, you're going to need another mechanism to allow it to neutralize, which we have. A little secretion from the pancreas called bicarbonate ions are released into the small intestine, and they neutralize that acid. So we don't have that when the food goes up from the from the stomach into the esophagus. So then we need to take a Tums pill or something like that. So you could almost think of the secretions from the pancreas as being almost a little internal Tums pill. So this slide here is showing the hormone response here when we eat. So when we eat, as soon as we eat or even think about eating, as soon as saliva is secreted, we have some increased gastric secretion and motility, and that comes from a hormone called gastrin. And so even if you're thinking about food or smelling food, that can cause those salivary glands to just start preparing for the food. So if maybe you've just eaten, but you smell that chocolate chip cookie or the movie theater popcorn, that can make that gastrin start your stomach grumbling, which is that secretion and motility. That grumbling is telling you it's time to eat, right? And we have that when we're physiologically hungry, but even if just psychologically we want to eat, sometimes our brain can sort of trick us into thinking we're super hungry. We also have hormones that are released once food is secreted into the small intestines through that pyloric valve that decrease gastric secretion and motility. So if you've ever heard that phrase, you have to wait 20 minutes to feel full, that's when the food starts being released from the stomach into the small intestine, and that gastric motility starts going down. And so that's why they say, don't eat too fast, eat a little bit slower. Now, the small intestines is where most of the action happens. So I mentioned that there are three parts of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The small intestines receive the chyme. So the chyme, remember, is that bolus of food. It's called chyme now once it's mixed with acid. It's moved by peristalsis and mixed by rhythmic contractions there, called segmentation. It's 20 feet long, somewhere between 18 and 20 feet long, and it has a large surface area, about 2 tennis courts worth, due to lots of folds and villi, which look like these little finger-like projections, and then microvilli that look like hairs on the fingers. And then undigested substances, if they're not absorbed there, they pass from the small intestines to the large intestines through another sphincter, and they go from the cecum to then the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon. So this is showing the various parts of the small intestine. So you can see that there's these large circular folds that allow that segmentation and peristalsis to occur. You can see that these villi or finger-like projections are just packed into the walls of the small intestine, really increasing that surface area. And then the little microvilli are little hairs on top of the villi, which pack them even further. So that's why if you unwound every microvilli and all the villi, you would end up with 2 tennis courts worth of surface area. You can see on each villi you have a variety of arteries, lymph vessels, and little veins. And so when we look at the foods that are absorbed, if they fit, they go into a venule and then go to the portal vein, which heads to the liver. If they are fat soluble, they go into a lacteal, head into a lymph vessel, and then are later dumped into the blood through the lymphatic system. And then you see that we have arteries too, and so the oxygen-rich blood from the arteries is going to fuel those intestines so they can then perform all the tasks that they need to perform. In terms of small intestinal secretions, we have the pancreas. It secretes the pancreatic juice, which contains the bicarbonate ions that I was talking about before that neutralize the stomach acid. That's our little, internal Tums pill there. We have pancreatic amylase. It helps to break down carbs into sugars, so that salivary amylase couldn't do the whole job itself, so you need some pancreatic amylase as backup once the salivary amylase is deactivated in the stomach. Then we have pancreatic proteases that change the proteins into amino acids, and pancreatic lipases that turn fats into fatty acids. The brush border is what the villi and microvilli, that whole intestinal lining is called, and that will secrete some digestive enzymes as well. Then we have the liver, which secretes bile. So the gallbladder stores it and will secrete some as well, but the liver will secrete bile into the small intestines, and that is responsible for emulsifying fat. So it breaks up the droplets. So you can almost think of bile as acting like, your commercial salad dressing emulsifiers, where when you make your own salad dressing, the oil floats on top of the vinegar, but when you buy it in a store, there's little droplets all spread throughout. Bile creates those little droplets, and that allows more surface area for enzymes to act on each of the fat molecules to break them down into small enough pieces to absorb. And so we'll go into all of this in detail and a little bit more in chapters 4, 5, and 6. In chapter 4, we'll really talk about that digestion of carbs. In chapter 5, the digestion of fat. And in chapter 6, the digestion of protein. But you can see, if you're just looking for an overview here, you can see that the carbs we eat, which are sugar, starch, and fiber, the sugar and starch is eventually broken down into single sugars called monosaccharides that are absorbed into the blood. Fiber is not absorbed, and so it continues throughout the GI tract. It does have functions, but that function is solely in the GI tract. Then we have amino acid chains from dietary proteins are broken down into individual amino acids and absorbed into the blood as well. And then large lipid droplets from fat are absorbed as fatty acids into the lymph. They're packaged into these big products called lipoproteins, and they don't fit in the blood, so you need to put them in the lymph and transport them that way. So they don't head to the liver first, they go right to the bloodstream. And this would be called absorption. So the absorption is that transport you see across the villi and microvilli of the particles either to the blood or to the lymph. So we can transport these products across the membranes in a few different ways. We can do this through diffusion, which is the movement of substances from higher concentration to lower concentration. Osmosis is considered diffusion of water across membranes. So you can use simple diffusion and osmosis kind of interchangeably, but osmosis refers to water. Facilitated diffusion diffuses through a very specific membrane protein, and then active transport requires a little energy for that to happen. So you're going from an area of lower to higher concentration. So different molecules and atoms are going to move across the membranes in different ways, and each nutrient has its own individual pathway that it moves through. These are the different ways. So you can see simple diffusion is over here on the left. Osmosis is second from the left. You can see the facilitated diffusion has a carrier molecule, but you're still moving from that area of higher to lower concentration. And then you have the active transport that requires some energy to carry out the process. So in our next lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about what happens after absorption, and then also what happens to undigested food that's not absorbed. But this is our point where we transport most of our nutrients from our GI tract into our body. So you can think of this as the point at which we travel across into the body, we're entering the body, and now the nutrients are going to have that opportunity to perform their functions of structure or regulation or energy. So stay tuned for part 3 of digestion, absorption, and metabolism coming up next.